The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Martinez stepped out of her Jeep. At 28, she looked barely old enough to drive, let alone command a medical unit in one of the world's most dangerous war zones. Her slight frame and baby face had earned her countless underestimations throughout her military career, but those who looked closely might have noticed something different about her walk. It wasn't the confident stride of someone trying to prove herself. It was the measured, deliberate movement of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, and learned to carry invisible weights that would crush most people. Sarah had arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix just 3 days earlier, assigned to lead the trauma medical team. The base sat in a valley surrounded by hostile territory, where enemy fire was as common as morning coffee, and medical emergencies arrived faster than anyone could prepare for them. When the other officers first saw her during the morning briefing, whispers followed her like shadows. She looked like she had just graduated from medical school, not someone who should be running emergency operations in a combat zone. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, had his own doubts when he first read her file. On paper, Captain Martinez looked impressive enough. Top of her medical school class, excellent marks in officer training, commendations for her work in field hospitals. But looking at her now, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with her hair pulled back in regulation style, she seemed more like someone who should be working in a peaceful hospital back home, not dealing with the chaos of battlefield medicine. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah carried secrets that would have shocked them all. Hidden beneath her uniform, carefully positioned where regulations allowed, were 5 small purple ribbons. Each one represented a Purple Heart Medal, awarded to service members wounded in action against enemy forces. 5 times Sarah had been injured in the line of duty. 5 times she had bled for her country. And 5 times she had gotten back up, returned to duty, and continued saving lives while her own life hung in the balance. The first Purple Heart came during her initial deployment to Afghanistan 2 years earlier. Sarah had been a newly minted lieutenant, then assigned to a field hospital that supported several remote outposts. She remembered that day with crystal clarity, though she wished she could forget it. The morning had started like any other, with routine medical checks and inventory of supplies. Then, the radio crackled to life with news that would change everything. A convoy had hit an improvised explosive device about 10 miles from their position. Multiple casualties were incoming, and the helicopter was already in the air. Sarah had been working in the medical tent when the first wounded soldiers arrived. The scene was chaos. Blood, screaming, medical equipment scattered everywhere as doctors and nurses fought to save lives. She was in the middle of working on a young soldier who couldn't have been older than 19 when the second attack came. Nobody expected the enemy to target the medical facility directly. It was supposed to be a safe zone, protected by international law and basic human decency. But wars don't follow rules, and enemies don't always respect boundaries. The mortar shells started falling without warning, and the first one hit close enough to shake the entire medical tent like a house of cards in an earthquake. Sarah was bent over her patient when the second shell hit even closer. The explosion was deafening, and she felt something hot tear through her left shoulder. For a moment, she couldn't understand what had happened. Then she saw the blood spreading across her uniform and realized she had been hit by shrapnel. The logical thing to do would have been to stop and treat her own wound, to call for help, and let someone else take over. Instead, Sarah pressed a bandage against her shoulder with one hand and continued working on her patient with the other. The young soldier on her table was bleeding internally, and if she stopped now, he would die. Her own wound could wait. It hurt like fire, and she could feel warm blood running down her arm, but she had work to do. She managed to stabilize the soldier just as another medic noticed she was wounded and insisted on treating her injury. By the time the attack was over and the wounded were evacuated, Sarah had saved 3 lives while dealing with her own injury. Her commanding officer recommended her for the Purple Heart, though Sarah didn't think she deserved it. She had just been doing her job, she insisted. The medal felt heavy in her hands when it was presented to her in a small ceremony weeks later. She didn't know then that it would be the first of 5. The second Purple Heart came 6 months later during what was supposed to be a routine medical supply run. Sarah had volunteered to accompany a convoy delivering essential medical supplies to a remote outpost that had been cut off for weeks. The journey should have taken 4 hours, but they had only been on the road for 2 hours when everything went wrong. The ambush came from 3 sides simultaneously. One moment they were driving through what seemed like empty desert, and the next moment the air was full of bullets and explosions. The convoy's vehicles tried to find cover, but there wasn't much available in the flat, open terrain. Sarah was in the second vehicle, along with 2 other medical personnel and a driver. When the first vehicle in their convoy hit a buried explosive device and flipped over, Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical kit and ran toward the burning vehicle, even though bullets were still flying and more explosions were shaking the ground. The driver of the lead vehicle was trapped inside, unconscious and bleeding heavily. Sarah crawled into the wreckage, ignoring the smoke and the heat and the very real possibility that the vehicle might explode at any moment. She managed to stabilize the driver's worst injuries and help pull him to safety just as enemy fighters started advancing on their position. That's when the rocket-propelled grenade hit near their defensive position. Sarah was helping to load wounded soldiers into the remaining vehicles when the explosion knocked her flat and sent shrapnel tearing through her right leg. This time the pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had set her leg on fire and then hit it with a sledgehammer. But again, she refused to stop working until every wounded soldier was loaded and they were moving to safety. The convoy made it back to base, though barely. Sarah spent 3 weeks in a hospital recovering from her leg wounds, but she was back on duty as soon as the doctors cleared her. The second Purple Heart joined the first in her personal belongings, another reminder of the price of service. Now, standing at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, Sarah touched the small ribbons on her uniform and thought about the journey that had brought her here. 3 more Purple Hearts had followed those first 2, each one representing another day when she had been wounded while trying to save others. Each medal told a story of pain and sacrifice, of moments when she had to choose between her own safety and the lives of the soldiers depending on her. But looking around at the other officers and soldiers at the base, Sarah knew they saw only what appeared to be a young, inexperienced captain who looked more suited to a civilian hospital than a combat zone. They had no idea about the battle she had already fought, the wounds she had already endured, or the lives she had already saved. They would learn, though, in a place like Forward Operating Base Phoenix, the truth about people had a way of coming out quickly. Lieutenant Morrison approached her as she stood looking out at the surrounding mountains. "Captain Martinez," he said, his tone polite but slightly skeptical, "I wanted to personally welcome you to Phoenix. I hope you're ready for what we deal with here. It can get pretty intense, and we need medical officers who can handle the pressure." Sarah turned to face him, and for just a moment, Morrison caught something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was the calm, steady gaze of someone who had already seen the worst that war could offer and had survived it. "Thank you, sir," she replied simply. "I'm ready for whatever comes our way." Morrison nodded, though he still had his doubts. The young captain would be tested soon enough. In a place like this, everybody was tested. He just hoped she was stronger than she looked, because the soldiers, depending on her medical skills, couldn't afford to have a weak link in the chain. As Morrison walked away, Sarah looked back at the mountains surrounding the base. Somewhere out there, enemy fighters were planning their next attack. Somewhere in the base, soldiers were going about their daily routines, not knowing which of them might be wounded or killed in the coming days. And somewhere in her own heart, Sarah was preparing herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had learned from her previous deployments that war was unpredictable and merciless. It didn't care if you were young or old, experienced or rookie, ready or unprepared. War took what it wanted and left scars on everyone it touched. But Sarah had also learned that she was stronger than she looked, tougher than anyone expected, and absolutely committed to saving every life she possibly could, no matter what it cost her personally. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Sarah made her way to the medical facility to meet her team. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emergencies, and quite possibly new dangers. But tonight, she would prepare. She would check equipment, review procedures, and get to know the medics and nurses who would be working under her command. Because when the next crisis came, and it would come, they all needed to be ready. Sarah Martinez might have looked like a rookie to the casual observer. But beneath that youthful exterior beat the heart of a warrior who had already proven her courage 5 times over. The soldiers at Forward Operating Base Phoenix were about to discover that their new medical officer was far more than she appeared to be. They were about to learn that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who have already been tested by fire and emerged stronger than before. The story of Captain Sarah Martinez was just beginning at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. But the chapters that had brought her to this moment were written in blood, courage, and an unshakable determination to serve others, no matter the personal cost. 5 Purple Hearts were just the beginning of her story. The real test was still to come. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn quiet at Forward Operating Base Phoenix like glass hitting concrete. Sarah bolted upright in her bunk, instantly awake and alert. After 2 years of combat deployments, her body had learned to respond to emergency calls before her mind fully processed what was happening. The red lights in the barracks were flashing, and over the intercom system, a voice was announcing what every soldier on the base dreaded hearing: mass casualty event. All medical personnel to stations immediately. This is not a drill. Sarah was dressed and running toward the medical facility before most of the other soldiers had even gotten out of their beds. Her small frame moved with surprising speed and purpose through the darkened corridors of the base. Behind her, she could hear other medical personnel scrambling to respond, but she was already thinking 3 steps ahead, mentally preparing for whatever crisis was about to walk through the doors of her medical unit. When she burst through the doors of the medical facility, the scene was organized chaos. Her team was already setting up additional treatment areas, preparing surgical equipment, and laying out supplies. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, her head nurse, looked up as Sarah entered. Gonzalez was a veteran with 15 years of military medical experience, and when she first met Sarah 3 days earlier, her skepticism had been written all over her face. A baby-faced captain who looked like she should be working in pediatrics wasn't exactly what Gonzalez had hoped for in a new commanding officer. "What do we know?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Convoy hit multiple IEDs about 15 miles out," Gonzalez replied, reading from the initial report. "At least 8 vehicles involved. Preliminary reports suggest 15 to 20 wounded, with several critical cases. First choppers will be here in 12 minutes. Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the logistics. 20 wounded meant they would need every available space in the medical facility, plus overflow areas. Critical cases meant surgical teams needed to be standing by. 12 minutes meant they had enough time to prepare properly if they moved fast and didn't waste any motion. "Set up triage stations at the main entrance," she ordered. "Get surgical team 1 prepped for immediate operations. Have team 2 standing by for the second wave. I want blood supplies ready and for stations set up in stations 1 through 4. Gonzalez, coordinate with the blood bank and make sure we have enough O-negative on hand." As her team moved to follow her orders, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. They were moving with efficiency and purpose, but without the confidence that came from complete trust in leadership. She could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. They were professional enough to follow orders, but they hadn't yet been convinced that their new captain knew what she was doing. That was about to change. The first helicopter arrived 11 minutes later, just as Sarah had predicted. The sound of rotor blades filled the air as the aircraft settled onto the landing pad outside the medical facility. Sarah was waiting at the entrance, along with her triage team, as the first casualties were unloaded. What she saw made her heart skip, but her expression remained calm and focused. The first soldier they brought in was barely conscious, with severe trauma to his chest and abdomen. Blood was soaked through his uniform, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Sarah took one look at him and made her first critical decision. "Surgery 1 now," she called out. "Get him prepped while I examine him." As they moved the soldier toward the surgical area, Sarah walked alongside the stretcher, her hands already working to assess his injuries. She could see immediately that he had internal bleeding, probably damage to his liver or spleen, and possibly damage to his lungs. This was exactly the kind of case that separated competent medical officers from exceptional ones. The second casualty was a young woman, a vehicle gunner who had taken shrapnel to her legs and arms. She was conscious, but in severe pain, and Sarah could see that while her injuries were serious, they weren't immediately life-threatening. "Station 2, she directed. "Clean the wounds and assess for arterial damage. I'll be there in 5 minutes." The third casualty made Sarah's breath catch in her throat, though she didn't let it show on her face. It was a soldier who couldn't have been older than 20, with burns covering 30% of his body and obvious signs of traumatic brain injury. His breathing was erratic, and his pupils weren't responding normally to light. This was the kind of case that could break a medical team's spirit if they weren't prepared for it. "Station 3, Sarah said quietly. "Full trauma protocol. Get neurosurgery on the phone." And so it went for the next 4 hours. Helicopter after helicopter arrived, bringing wounded soldiers who had been caught in what was obviously a well-planned and devastating attack. Sarah moved between stations like a conductor directing an orchestra, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for each patient. What her team didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that every decision Sarah made was informed by experiences that had cost her dearly. When she looked at the soldier with chest trauma, she remembered her third Purple Heart, earned when she had been caught in a similar explosion and had to perform emergency medical procedures on herself and others while dealing with her own punctured lung. When she treated the soldier with burns, she remembered her fourth Purple Heart, earned during a firefight when she had run into a burning vehicle to rescue wounded soldiers and had suffered second-degree burns on her arms and back. The pain of treating burn victims was something she understood from personal experience. When she worked on the soldier with traumatic brain injury, she remembered her fifth Purple Heart, earned when an explosion had thrown her against a concrete wall and given her a concussion so severe that she had lost consciousness for several minutes. She had awakened to find wounded soldiers around her and had continued providing medical care despite her own head injury. Each Purple Heart had taught her something different about trauma medicine, about pain management, about the human body's remarkable ability to survive incredible damage. More importantly, each injury had taught her about the psychological aspects of trauma care, about how to remain calm in chaos, and about how to project confidence even when facing seemingly impossible situations. As the hours passed, Sarah's team began to notice something remarkable. Their new captain wasn't just competent, she was extraordinary. She seemed to know exactly what each patient needed before they were even fully examined. She anticipated complications before they developed. She managed resources and personnel with an efficiency that bordered on uncanny. Sergeant Gonzalez watched Sarah perform emergency surgery on the soldier with abdominal trauma and realized she was witnessing something special. The captain's hands moved with absolute precision and confidence. Her voice remained calm and steady even when complications arose. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of battlefield trauma that went far beyond what any medical school could teach. "How long has she been doing this?" Gonzalez asked Corpsman Williams, who was assisting with the surgery. "I don't know," Williams replied, "but she moves like someone who's been in combat medicine for years, not months." What they didn't know was that Sarah had been in combat medicine for years, and every one of those years had left its mark on her body and her soul. The 5 Purple Hearts hidden under her uniform were just the visible evidence of a much deeper story of sacrifice and dedication. By noon, they had treated 23 wounded soldiers. 19 of them would make full recoveries. 3 would have permanent disabilities, but would survive. 1 had died despite every effort to save him, a young soldier whose injuries had simply been too severe for any medical intervention to help. Sarah was in the middle of updating patient records when Lieutenant Colonel Morrison appeared at the entrance to the medical facility. He had been monitoring the situation all morning, and what he had observed had fundamentally changed his opinion of his new medical officer. "Captain Martinez," he said as he approached her, "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did today. I've been watching your team work, and I have to say that was some of the most impressive medical work I've ever seen in a combat zone." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, and Morrison noticed something he hadn't seen before. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of experiences beyond her years. Her hands, which he had thought looked too small and delicate for combat medicine, showed small scars that told stories of their own. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "My team did exceptional work today. They're what made the difference." "Maybe so," Morrison said, "but teams need strong leadership to perform like that. Where did you learn to manage mass casualties like that? Medical school doesn't usually prepare people for that level of trauma medicine." For a moment, Sarah considered telling him the truth. She thought about mentioning the 5 Purple Hearts, the previous deployments, the time she had been wounded while saving others. Instead, she simply said, "Experience, sir. You learn fast when lives depend on it." Morrison nodded, though something in her answer made him curious. There was a weight in her words that suggested more experience than her apparent age should allow. He made a mental note to take a closer look at her complete service record when he had time. As Morrison left the medical facility, Sarah returned to her paperwork. Around her, her team was cleaning up from the morning's emergency and preparing for whatever might come next. She could sense that something had changed in their attitude toward her. The skepticism was gone, replaced by respect and confidence in her leadership. Sergeant Gonzalez approached her as she was finishing the last of her reports. "Captain," she said, "I have to admit, when you first arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. But after today, I want you to know that you have my complete confidence. That was outstanding work." "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "But we're not done yet. In a place like this, there's always another emergency coming. We need to be ready." As if her words had been prophetic, the alarm system activated again just as she finished speaking. This time, the announcement was different. "Incoming hostile fire. All personnel to defensive positions. Medical teams stand by for casualties." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with combat situations, but she also felt something else, the quiet confidence that came from experience. She had been through this before many times. She knew what to expect, how to prepare, and how to keep her team focused when bullets started flying. What she didn't know was that this new crisis would test her in ways she hadn't experienced before. The attack that was about to hit Forward Operating Base Phoenix would be unlike anything the base had faced, and it would push Sarah and her team to their absolute limits. The young captain who looked like a rookie was about to face the challenge that would either prove her worth beyond any doubt or break her completely. Either way, the soldiers of Forward Operating Base Phoenix were about to discover just how much strength could be hidden behind an unassuming exterior. Outside, the sound of incoming artillery was growing louder. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her equipment one more time, and prepared to face whatever was coming next. 5 Purple Hearts had prepared her for this moment. Though nobody around her knew it, yet the first artillery shell hit the outer perimeter of Forward Operating Base Phoenix with a thunderous roar that shook the medical facility like an earthquake. Sarah felt the impact through the soles of her feet and immediately began mental calculations that had become second nature to her over years of combat deployments. Distance, trajectory, probable number of weapons involved. Within seconds, she had determined that this wasn't a random attack or a probing raid. This was a full-scale assault designed to overrun the base. "All non-essential personnel to the bunkers," she called out to her medical team. "Essential staff, we stay here and prepare for incoming wounded. This is going to be a long day." Sergeant Gonzalez looked at her with concern. Captain, shouldn't we evacuate the medical facility? If they're targeting the base, they might hit us directly. Sarah shook her head, her expression calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Medical facilities are supposed to be protected under international law, but laws don't stop bullets. We need to be ready to treat our people when they start coming in. Set up the operating rooms for trauma surgery and get the blood bank ready. As her team moved to follow her orders, Sarah felt a familiar sensation that she had experienced 4 times before. It was the strange calm that came over her in moments of extreme danger, when her training and experience took over and pushed aside fear and uncertainty. She had learned to trust this feeling because it had kept her alive and allowed her to save others when everything around her was falling apart. The second and third shells hit closer to the main base buildings, and Sarah could hear the distinct sound of small arms fire beginning to crackle in the distance. Through the windows of the medical facility, she could see soldiers running to defensive positions while others worked to secure equipment and supplies. The attack was escalating quickly, and it was becoming clear that the enemy had planned this assault carefully. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice came over the intercom system, steady but urgent. "This is Base Commander. We are under coordinated attack from multiple directions. All personnel to defensive positions according to emergency protocols. Casualties are expected. Medical teams remain on standby." Sarah nodded to herself. Morrison was handling the situation exactly as she would have expected from an experienced commander. But she also knew that no matter how well prepared the defenders were, people were going to get hurt. That's where she and her team came in. The first casualties arrived 15 minutes after the attack began. 2 soldiers had been caught in the open when the artillery bombardment started, and both had suffered serious injuries from shrapnel. Sarah took one look at them and immediately shifted into the focused, efficient mode that had become her trademark during crisis situations. Patient 1 has penetrating abdominal trauma and possible internal bleeding, she announced as the first soldier was brought in. Get him to surgery 2 immediately. Patient 2 has multiple lacerations and what looks like a fractured femur. Station 3 for emergency stabilization. As her team worked on the wounded soldiers, more explosions shook the building. Sarah could tell from the sound and intensity that the enemy was walking their fire closer to the medical facility. Whether it was intentional targeting or just the random chaos of warfare, the medical unit was definitely in danger. "Gonzalez," she called out as she worked to stop bleeding in patient 2's leg. "Get on the radio and find out what our evacuation procedures are if we take a direct hit. I want to know how we move critical patients if we have to abandon this building." "Yes, ma'am," Gonzalez replied, though Sarah could hear the concern in her voice. The sergeant had been through combat situations before, but nothing quite like this. 20 minutes after the first casualties arrived, the radio crackled with a new emergency call that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Medical team, we have multiple casualties at the north wall. Heavy fire can't get them out. Need immediate medical support in the field." Sarah looked around at her team. They were already stretched thin dealing with the casualties they had, and the idea of sending medical personnel into an active firefight went against every safety protocol they had been taught. But soldiers were wounded and dying, and those soldiers needed medical attention that they couldn't get where they were. "I'm going," Sarah announced, grabbing her field medical kit and body armor. "Captain, that's not advisable," Corpsman Williams called out. "We need you here, and it's too dangerous out there." Sarah paused at the door and turned back to her team. For a moment, they saw something in her expression that surprised them. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was determination mixed with something that looked almost like familiarity, as if she had done this before and knew exactly what she was getting into. "Williams, you're in charge until I get back," she said. "Follow standard trauma protocols and don't take any unnecessary risks. I'll be back with the wounded from a north wall." Before anyone could protest further, Sarah was out the door and running toward the sound of gunfire. The scene outside the medical facility was something from a nightmare. Smoke was rising from several buildings that had been hit by artillery. Soldiers were moving between defensive positions, some carrying wounded comrades, others laying down covering fire for evacuation efforts. The air was filled with the constant chatter of automatic weapons and the occasional boom of larger explosions. Sarah ran in a crouch toward the north wall, her medical kit bouncing on her back and her body armor feeling heavier with each step. She had done this before, but it never got easier, running toward danger when every instinct in her body was telling her to find cover and stay safe when against basic human nature. But soldiers were wounded, and that was all that mattered. The north wall was a scene of devastation. An enemy rocket had hit the defensive position directly, destroying part of the wall and leaving several soldiers trapped in the rubble. 3 soldiers were lying in the open, unable to move because of their injuries, while enemy fire made it impossible for their comrades to reach them safely. Sarah assessed the situation quickly. The 3 wounded soldiers were about 30 yards from the nearest cover, in a position that was partially exposed to enemy fire. Getting to them would require crossing open ground under hostile fire, treating their injuries in the open, and then somehow getting them back to safety. She had done exactly this kind of rescue 3 years earlier during her second deployment. That was when she had earned her 3rd Purple Heart after being shot through the shoulder while trying to reach wounded soldiers in a similar situation. The memory of that day was burned into her mind, but it also provided her with knowledge about how to handle this situation. "Cover me," she called out to the soldiers at the defensive position. "I'm going after the wounded." "Ma'am, that's suicide," one of the soldiers called back. "There's too much fire coming from those buildings." "Maybe," Sarah replied, checking her medical kit one more time. "But those soldiers out there will die if we don't get to them soon. I've done this before." Without waiting for further discussion, Sarah sprinted from cover toward the first wounded soldier. Bullets immediately started impacting the ground around her, kicking up dust and debris. She heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to her head, but she kept running. 30 yards had never felt so long. The first soldier she reached was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a head wound. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him and immediately began working to stop the bleeding and assess his other injuries. Around her, bullets continued to snap through the air, but she forced herself to focus entirely on her patient. The soldier had a severe concussion and was bleeding from a scalp laceration that needed immediate attention. Sarah applied pressure bandages to the head wound and checked his pulse and breathing. He was alive, but he needed evacuation immediately. "I need help over here," she called out to the defensive position, but her voice was lost in the sound of gunfire. The second wounded soldier was about 10 yards away, conscious but unable to move because of what looked like a broken leg. Sarah looked at the distance between her current position and the next patient, calculated the time it would take to cross that open ground, and made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of trying to treat each patient separately, she decided to move them all to a slightly more protected position behind a damaged section of wall. It would require more exposure to enemy fire, but it would allow her to work on all 3 patients while providing some cover. Sarah grabbed the unconscious soldier under his arms and began dragging him toward the cover position. He was much heavier than her small frame should have been able to handle, but adrenaline and experience gave her the strength she needed. As she moved, bullets continued to impact around her, and she could hear enemy voices shouting in the distance. The drag to cover took what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Once she had the first patient in a relatively safe position, Sarah ran back for the second soldier. This one was conscious and able to help somewhat, so the move went faster, though it was no less dangerous. The third wounded soldier was the most serious case. He had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen and was bleeding internally. Sarah could see immediately that he needed surgical intervention within the next few minutes or he would die. This was exactly the kind of situation that separated good field medics from exceptional ones. Working behind the damaged wall section, with enemy fire still snapping overhead, Sarah began performing emergency medical procedures that she had learned through the hardest possible experience. She established an airway for the chest wound patient, started 4 fluids to combat shock, and applied pressure dressings to control external bleeding. The second patient, with the broken leg, was stable enough to wait for evacuation. The third patient, the one with the head injury, was beginning to regain consciousness, which was a good sign. But as Sarah worked, she realized they were still in a very dangerous position. Enemy fire was getting closer and more accurate, and she could hear voices and movement that suggested enemy fighters were advancing on their position. They needed evacuation immediately, but the route back to safety was still under heavy fire. That's when she heard a sound that made her heart jump with relief. The distinctive roar of the base's heavy machine guns had opened up, laying down suppressing fire on the enemy positions. Someone had organized a covering force to help get the wounded out. Medical evacuation, North Wall, came Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice over the radio. We're laying down cover fire. Move now. Sarah looked at her 3 patients and made rapid decisions about how to move them. The chest wound patient needed to be carried by stretcher. The head injury patient could walk with assistance. The broken leg patient would need to be carried. I need stretcher bearers at the North Wall, she called into radio. 3 critical patients ready for evacuation. Within minutes, soldiers were running across the open ground toward her position, carrying stretchers and moving with the kind of courage that still amazed Sarah even after years of witnessing it. These men and women were risking their lives to save wounded comrades, and they did it without hesitation or complaint. The evacuation back to the medical facility was conducted under continued enemy fire, but the covering force kept the hostile fire suppressed enough to allow the rescue team to move. Sarah ran alongside the stretchers, continuing to monitor her patients and provide medical care even while bullets were still flying around them. When they finally reached the medical facility, Sarah's team was waiting with everything prepared for immediate trauma surgery. The chest wound patient was rushed directly to surgery, while the other 2 patients were taken to trauma stations for continued treatment. As the emergency settled into routine medical procedures, Sarah finally had a moment to catch her breath and assess what had just happened. She had run into enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, treated them under hostile fire, and successfully evacuated all 3 patients. It was exactly the kind of mission that had earned her previous Purple Hearts. Sergeant Gonzalez approached her as she was cleaning blood off her hands. "Captain," she said, her voice filled with something that sounded like awe. "I've never seen anything like what you just did. Where did you learn to operate under fire like that?" Sarah looked at her sergeant and realized that the time for maintaining her anonymity was probably over. Her team had just witnessed her in action under the most extreme circumstances possible, and they deserved to know who they were really working for. "Experience, Sergeant," she replied quietly. "Sometimes you learn things the hard way." As she spoke, Sarah unconsciously touched the area where her Purple Heart ribbons were hidden under her uniform. Each medal represented a day when she had been wounded while trying to save others. Today might very well add a 6th medal to that collection, though she wouldn't know until the shooting stopped and she could properly assess whether she had been hit. The battle for Forward Operating Base Phoenix was far from over, but Sarah Martinez had just proven beyond any doubt that she was far more than the rookie officer she appeared to be. Her team now knew they were working for someone with exceptional skills and courage. What they didn't know was that those skills had been paid for with blood and pain that most people couldn't imagine. The day was far from over, and more challenges were coming. But Sarah was ready for whatever came next. The battle for Forward Operating Base Phoenix raged for 18 hours, and by the time the last enemy fighter had been repelled, Sarah Martinez had performed medical miracles that would be talked about for years among the soldiers who witnessed them. But it was what happened in the final 4 hours of the battle that would change everything, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who thought they knew who she really was. The enemy's final assault began at 3 in the morning, when most of the base was exhausted from nearly a full day of combat. Sarah had been working without rest for 20 hours straight, treating a constant stream of wounded soldiers while the battle raged around the medical facility. Her team was operating on pure adrenaline and determination, but they were beginning to show signs of fatigue that worried her. The attack came from an unexpected direction. While the main enemy force continued to assault the north and east walls of the base, a smaller group had infiltrated through a drainage system that intelligence had missed. They emerged inside the base perimeter, behind the main defensive lines, and began attacking critical facilities from within. Sarah was in the middle of emergency surgery on a soldier with multiple shrapnel wounds when the first explosion rocked the medical facility from the inside. The lights went out immediately, and emergency power kicked in with a red glow that every soldier associated with crisis situations. But this wasn't just another artillery shell hitting nearby. Someone was inside the medical facility. Contact inside the building. Came the urgent call over the intercom. Enemy fighters in the medical facility. All security personnel respond immediately. Sarah looked up from her patient, her hands still inside the soldier's chest cavity where she was trying to repair damage to his lung. Around her, she could hear gunfire echoing through the corridors of the medical facility. Her team looked to her for guidance, their faces showing the kind of fear that came when the one place that was supposed to be safe suddenly became a battlefield. "Keep working," Sarah ordered, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "We don't abandon patients. Security will handle the threat." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that security might not be able to respond fast enough. The medical facility was a large building with many rooms and corridors, and a small group of determined fighters could cause tremendous damage before they were stopped. More importantly, the patients in the facility were completely helpless if the enemy reached the treatment areas. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and Sarah could hear voices shouting in a language she recognized as the local dialect used by enemy fighters. They were moving through the building systematically, probably looking for high-value targets or trying to destroy medical equipment and supplies. "Gonzalez," Sarah called out to her head nurse, "take Williams and get the ambulatory patients to the secure area. Anyone who can move under their own power needs to get out of here now." "What about the critical patients?" Gonzalez asked, looking at the soldier on Sarah's operating table and 3 other patients who were too injured to move. "We stay with them," Sarah replied without hesitation. "We don't abandon patients, no matter what happens." As her team began evacuating the patients who could be moved, Sarah continued working on the soldier with the lung injury. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but part of her mind was calculating distances and possibilities. The gunfire was getting closer, and she estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before the enemy fighters reached the surgical areas. That's when she heard a sound that made her stomach drop. The distinctive voice of Sergeant Peterson, one of the security guards assigned to protect the medical facility, calling for help over the radio. He was wounded and couldn't hold his position much longer. The enemy was about to break through the last defensive barrier between them and the patients. Sarah looked at the soldier on her operating table. She was halfway through a delicate procedure to repair his damaged lung, and if she stopped now, he would almost certainly die. But if the enemy fighters reached the operating room, they would kill everyone in the facility, including this patient and all the others who couldn't be moved. For a moment that lasted forever, Sarah faced the kind of impossible choice that had haunted her dreams since her first deployment. Save one life by finishing the surgery, or protect multiple lives by dealing with the immediate threat. Either choice could result in people dying, and either choice would leave her wondering for the rest of her life if she had made the right decision. Then, Sarah did something that surprised even her experienced team. She quickly completed the most critical part of the lung repair, applied temporary stabilization measures to her patient, and handed the surgical instruments to Corpsman Williams. "Continue the procedure according to standard protocol," she ordered. "I'll be back in a few minutes." "Captain, where are you going?" Williams asked, but Sarah was already moving toward an equipment cabinet near the operating room door. What happened next shocked everyone in the room. Sarah opened the cabinet and pulled out something that none of them had expected to see in a medical facility: a military-issue sidearm and extra ammunition. She checked the weapon with the quick, efficient movements of someone who had used firearms extensively, then moved toward the door of the operating room. "Captain Martinez," Gonzalez called out, "you can't go out there. You're a medical officer, not a combat soldier." Sarah paused at the door and turned back to look at her team. They saw something in her expression that they had never seen before. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was the cold, focused look of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to follow through with it, no matter what it cost. "Continue treating patients," she said quietly. "That's an order. I'll handle the threat." Then she was through the door and moving into the darkened corridors of a medical facility. Sarah moved through the building with a confidence that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew her. She wasn't moving like a medical officer who had picked up a weapon out of desperation. She was moving like someone who had extensive training in close-quarters combat, someone who understood building layouts and tactical movement. The sound of gunfire led her toward the main entrance area of the facility, where she could hear voices shouting in the enemy's language. Sarah moved carefully, using cover and concealment the way she had been trained to do. What her medical team didn't know, what very few people knew, was that Sarah Martinez had been more than just a medical officer during her previous deployments. Before joining the medical corps, Sarah had spent 2 years as a military police officer, specializing in base security and protection of high-value assets. She had received extensive training in small unit tactics, close-quarters combat, and building clearing operations. When she transferred to medical, she had retained her security clearances and had often been assigned to units that needed medical officers with combat experience. Her 5 Purple Hearts hadn't just been earned while providing medical care. They had been earned while fighting as well as healing during missions where she had served as both medic and soldier, depending on what the situation required. Sarah Martinez was a warrior who happened to be an exceptional doctor, not just a doctor who found herself in combat situations. Moving through the medical facility, Sarah quickly identified the location and number of enemy fighters. There were 4 of them, armed with assault rifles and explosives, and they were systematically destroying equipment and looking for targets of opportunity. They had already killed Sergeant Peterson and were moving toward the patient care areas. Sarah positioned herself at a choke point in the corridor system where she could engage the enemy fighters as they moved toward the critical care areas. She had the advantage of knowing the building layout better than they did, and she had the motivation of knowing that soldiers under her care would die if she failed. The first enemy fighter came around the corner, moving fast and confident, clearly not expecting resistance from anyone in a medical facility. Sarah's first shot dropped him before he could react. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed corridor was deafening, but Sarah was already moving to a new position before the other fighters could respond. The next 2 fighters came around the corner together, having heard the shooting and knowing they were walking into a fight. Sarah waited until they were committed to their movement, then engaged both targets rapidly. Her shooting was precise and controlled, the result of extensive training and experience that went far beyond what most medical officers received. The 4th fighter was smarter than his companions. Instead of rushing into the corridor where his friends had been killed, he took a defensive position and tried to call for backup on his radio. Sarah could hear him speaking urgently in his native language, probably calling for reinforcements or trying to coordinate with other enemy units. Sarah knew she had to end this quickly. If the enemy fighter successfully called for help, more fighters would arrive, and the situation would become even more dangerous for her patients. She moved carefully through the building's secondary corridors, using her knowledge of the layout to approach the enemy's position from an unexpected angle. The final engagement lasted only seconds. Sarah approached from behind, using cover and concealment to get close to the enemy fighter's position. When she had a clear shot, she took it without hesitation. The threat to her patients was eliminated. As silence settled over the medical facility, Sarah quickly moved through the building to ensure there were no additional threats. She checked on Sergeant Peterson, but he was beyond help. She secured the weapons from the dead enemy fighters and radioed for security reinforcements to help secure the building. Then, as quickly as she had transformed into a combat soldier, Sarah transformed back into a medical officer. She returned to the operating room, where her team was still working on the soldier with a lung injury, checked his progress, and resumed the surgery as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Her team had heard the gunfire. They had heard her engaging enemy fighters throughout the building. They had seen her return with blood on her uniform that wasn't for medical procedures. They knew now that Captain Sarah Martinez was far more than she appeared to be. "Captain," Corpsman Williams said as she resumed the surgery, "where did you learn to do that?" Sarah concentrated on her patient for a moment before answering. The soldier on the table was stable now, his lung repair was successful, and he would survive. Around her, she could see her team looking at her with expressions that mixed respect, amazement, and curiosity. "Military police," she said simply, "before I became a doctor. Sometimes you need different skills to protect your patients." "Is that where you got your experience with combat medicine?" Gonzalez asked. Sarah nodded, but she didn't elaborate. What she didn't tell them was that her military police experience had been just the beginning. The real education had come during her medical deployments, when she had been wounded 5 times while serving in dual roles as healer and protector. As dawn broke over Forward Operating Base Phoenix, the battle was finally ending. The enemy had been repelled, the base was secure, and the wounded were receiving the care they needed. Sarah's medical team had performed magnificently under impossible conditions, saving lives while under direct attack. But now her team knew they had been working for someone extraordinary. The young captain who had looked like a rookie when she arrived at the base had revealed herself to be a combat veteran with skills and experience that few people possessed. She was a healer and a warrior, a doctor and a soldier, someone who could save lives and take them when necessary to protect her patients. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison arrived at the medical facility as Sarah was completing her final surgery of the long battle. He had heard about what happened during the enemy infiltration, and he wanted to personally thank the medical officer who had single-handedly eliminated the threat to his wounded soldiers. "Captain Martinez," he said as he found her cleaning up from the surgery, "I understand you had some excitement here during the night." "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied, but Morrison could see something different in her expression. The young officer who had seemed uncertain when she first arrived was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet confidence and competence. "I'm going to need a full report on the incident," Morrison said, "but I also want you to know that what you did tonight will not be forgotten. You saved lives, both as a doctor and as a soldier." Sarah nodded, knowing that her secret was finally out. There would be questions about her background, her training, and her previous service. People would want to know how a medical officer had acquired the skills to single-handedly eliminate an enemy infiltration team. But for now, all that mattered was that her patients were safe and her team was intact. The battle for Forward Operating Base Phoenix was over, but Sarah Martinez knew that her real story was just beginning to be understood by the people around her. The young woman who carried 5 Purple Hearts had finally shown the world who she really was 3 days after the battle that had nearly destroyed Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison sat in his office reviewing the most unusual service record he had ever encountered. Captain Sarah Martinez's complete military file had arrived via encrypted transmission that morning, and what he read changed everything he thought he knew about his young medical officer. The file painted a picture of a soldier who had served her country with distinction and courage that went far beyond what anyone could have expected. Sarah Martinez hadn't just been wounded 5 times in combat. She had been wounded 5 times while performing acts of heroism that had saved dozens of lives and changed the outcomes of multiple engagements. Her first Purple Heart came with a Bronze Star for Valor, awarded for her actions during the field hospital attack in Afghanistan. The citation described how she had continued treating wounded soldiers while under enemy fire, despite suffering shrapnel wounds to her shoulder. 3 soldiers owed their lives to her decision to keep working despite her own injuries. The second Purple Heart was accompanied by a Silver Star, earned during the convoy ambush when she had run into a burning vehicle to rescue a trapped driver. The explosion that wounded her leg had occurred while she was pulling the unconscious driver to safety, and her actions had prevented what would have been the first casualty of that attack. The third Purple Heart came with another Bronze Star, this one for her actions during a firefight when she had crossed open ground under enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers who were trapped in a bomb building. She had been shot through the shoulder while dragging the second wounded soldier to safety, but she had gone back for a third soldier despite her injury. The fourth Purple Heart was awarded after she had run into a burning ammunition depot to rescue soldiers trapped by an explosion and fire. The burns she suffered on her arms and back were severe enough to require skin grafts, but she had saved 4 lives that day. The fifth Purple Heart came with a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor in combat. Sarah had been serving as both medical officer and acting commander of a small outpost when it came under coordinated attack by overwhelming enemy forces. During the 8-hour battle, she had been wounded by an explosion that gave her a severe concussion, but she had continued to command the defense and treat wounded soldiers until reinforcement arrived. 5 Purple Hearts, 3 Bronze Stars, 1 Silver Star, and a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. Morrison had never seen a service record like it, especially not from someone who looked like she should be working in a civilian hospital rather than fighting in combat zones. But there was more in the file that explained some of the mystery. Before transferring to medical, Sarah Martinez had indeed served as a military police officer specializing in force protection and close-quarters combat. Her training records showed expert-level qualifications in small arms, demolitions, tactical movement, and hand-to-hand combat. She had served in that capacity for 2 years before attending medical school on a military scholarship. What made her record even more unusual was that she had specifically requested assignment to forward combat units rather than safer rear-area hospitals. Every assignment she had received had been to places where medical officers were most likely to face combat situations. She had sought out danger, not avoided it. There was also a psychological evaluation in her file that shed light on her motivations. The military psychologist had noted that Captain Martinez seemed driven by an overwhelming sense of responsibility for the welfare of soldiers under her care. She appeared to view her medical training not just as a way to heal people, but as a way to serve in the most dangerous situations where her skills could make the greatest difference. The psychologist had recommended her for continued service, but had noted that she might be prone to taking unnecessary risks in order to save others. Looking at her record of 5 Purple Hearts, Morrison thought that assessment had been remarkably accurate. Now, reading through the complete picture of Sarah Martinez's military service, Morrison understood why she had seemed so competent during the battle for Forward Operating Base Phoenix. She hadn't been learning on the job. She had been applying years of hard-earned experience to a new situation. Morrison was interrupted in his reading by a knock on his office door. "Come in," he called, and was surprised to see Captain Martinez herself standing in the doorway. She was in full dress uniform, and Morrison noticed for the first time that she was wearing the ribbons that corresponded to her decorations. The 5 Purple Hearts were clearly visible, along with the Bronze Stars, Silver Star, and other awards she had earned. "Captain Martinez," Morrison said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I was just reading your complete service record. I have to say, it makes for fascinating reading." Sarah sat down and looked directly at Morrison. "I know you have questions, sir. I'm here to answer them." "The first question is obvious," Morrison said. "Why didn't you mention your previous service when you arrived here? Your record would have immediately established your credibility with the entire base." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Sir, I've learned that people sometimes react strangely when they know about the Purple Hearts. Some people treat you like you're fragile, like you might break under pressure. Others treat you like you're some kind of superhero, which is just as problematic. I prefer to let my work speak for itself." Morrison nodded. He could understand that perspective, though he still thought she had carried the modest approach too far. What about your combat skills? You eliminated 4 enemy fighters in the medical facility like you'd been doing it your whole career. Military police training, plus experience in situations where medical officers had to fight as well as heal, Sarah replied. In forward combat units, doctors sometimes have to defend their patients. I made sure I was prepared for that possibility. 5 Purple Hearts is more than being prepared, Morrison observed. That's actively seeking out dangerous situations. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, Morrison heard something in her voice that hadn't been there before. It was a weariness that spoke of experiences beyond her years, of choices that had cost her more than physical wounds. Sir, every one of those Purple Hearts represents a moment when I had to choose between my own safety and the lives of soldiers who were depending on me. I've never regretted those choices, but they weren't easy decisions. Each time I was wounded, it was because I put myself in danger to save someone else. Why? Morrison asked simply. Sarah looked out the window of his office toward the mountains surrounding Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Because that's what we do, sir. We're soldiers. We protect each other. And as a medical officer, I have additional responsibilities to preserve life whenever possible. Morrison studied her face as she spoke, and he saw something that impressed him even more than her service record. Despite everything she had been through, despite the wounds and the trauma and the constant exposure to danger, Sarah Martinez remained committed to her mission of healing and protecting others. She hadn't become hardened or cynical. She had become stronger. I have another question, Morrison said. Your file shows that you've requested assignment to the most dangerous postings available. Why do you keep volunteering for places like this? Sarah turned back to look at him, and Morrison saw a flash of something that might have been vulnerability before it was replaced by determination. Because this is where the work matters most, sir. In safe hospitals back home, there are plenty of doctors who could do the job well. Out here, in places like this, medical officers need additional skills and experience to keep soldiers alive. I have those skills, so this is where I belong. Even if it costs you more Purple Hearts. Morrison asked. Even then, Sarah replied without hesitation. Morrison closed her file and leaned back in his chair. Captain, I want you to know that after what I've read and what I've observed, I consider you to be one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to command. Your courage, your skills, and your dedication are exceptional. Thank you, sir, Sarah said, but Morrison could tell she was uncomfortable with the praise. However, he continued, I also want you to know that I'm going to be watching you carefully. Your record suggests a pattern of taking risks that go beyond what duty requires. I need to make sure you don't get yourself killed trying to save everyone else. Sarah nodded. Understood, sir, but I won't change my approach to patient care. If soldiers are in danger and I can help them, I will. I wouldn't expect anything less, Morrison replied. But I also won't tolerate any unnecessary heroics. This base needs you alive and functional, not wounded or dead. After Sarah left his office, Morrison sat thinking about their conversation. He had met many exceptional soldiers during his military career, but Sarah Martinez was unique. She combined medical expertise with combat skills, tactical intelligence with genuine compassion, and personal courage with a deep sense of responsibility for others. But he was also concerned about her. The psychological profile in her file had noted that she seemed to view her own safety as less important than the welfare of her patients. 5 Purple Hearts suggested that assessment was accurate, and Morrison worried that her willingness to sacrifice herself for others might eventually cost her life. Later that day, Morrison made a decision that would change Sarah's career trajectory. He composed a message to higher headquarters recommending Captain Martinez for promotion and assignment to a position where her unique combination of skills could be used to train other medical officers. She had proven herself as both a healer and a warrior, and the military needed more officers with her capabilities. Meanwhile, Sarah was back in the medical facility, working with her team to prepare for whatever challenges might come next. The battle for Forward Operating Base Phoenix had proven that enemy forces were willing to attack medical facilities directly, and she wanted to make sure her team was prepared to defend their patients if necessary. Sergeant Gonzalez approached her as she was reviewing defensive procedures with the medical staff. "Captain," she said, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did during the attack. But I also wanted to ask you something." "What's that, Sergeant? Are you going to stay with us?" Gonzalez asked. "I mean, with your record and your experience, you could probably get assigned anywhere you wanted." Sarah looked around at her team, the soldiers who had proven themselves during the most challenging circumstances imaginable. They had worked with courage and competence while under direct attack, and they had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost. "I'm staying as long as the military will let me," she replied. "This is important work, and you're good people to work with. Besides, somebody needs to make sure you all stay out of trouble." Gonzalez smiled. "With respect, Captain, I think you're the one who finds trouble, not us." Sarah laughed, and for the first time since arriving at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she looked truly relaxed. "Maybe you're right about that, Sergeant. But at least I find the kind of trouble that's worth getting into." As the sun set over the mountains surrounding the base, Sarah Martinez reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 5 purple hearts represented 5 moments when she had been wounded while serving others. 3 bronze stars and a silver star represented recognition for courage beyond what duty required. And now, for the first time in her military career, she was serving with a team that knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The young woman who had looked like a rookie when she first arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix had proven herself to be one of the most experienced and capable combat medical officers in the military. Her story was far from over, but she had finally found a place where her unique combination of skills and dedication could make the greatest possible difference. Sarah Martinez carried 5 purple hearts, but more importantly, she carried the knowledge that she had earned them while saving the lives of fellow soldiers. In a career dedicated to healing and protecting others, those medals represented not just her wounds, but her victories in the endless battle against death and suffering. The rookie who wasn't really a rookie had found her home among soldiers who understood the true price of service and the real meaning of sacrifice. And in that understanding, she had found the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you were meant to do.